Today we talk to Richard Kozul-Wright, head of UNCTAD's Globalization and Development Strategies Division, about the systemic risks of policy inaction in the face of one of our generation's biggest challenges, the coronavirus, a microscopic pathogen that has upended everything and in doing so exposed the many hyper-inequalities we've been struggling to address. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Amy, thanks for the opportunity to present this year's Trade and Development Report.
Richard, we are entering a profound recession, seemingly caused by COVID-19, but the Trade and Development Report argues that the virus was simply an unprecedented shock that rocked an already deeply unstable system. What weaknesses has it exposed and why is this so bad?
I think the best way to get at this is to go back to the 2009 global financial crisis, which was another big shock to the system. And at that time, the promise was to recover better, right? We would tame finance, control these banks that had become too big to fail, deal with these toxic financial products that had caused the crisis in the first place, deal with problems of irresponsible financial behavior. So taming finance was the big promise. We would tackle inequality. Inequality was exposed by the global financial crisis. So the promise was that we would deal with corporations that had become excessively rent-seeking. We would deal with the problem of low wages and thereby bring about a somewhat fairer outcome than had been exposed by the global financial crisis. And we would rebuild trust in the multilateral system, deal with the problems in the WTO, get the Doha development round finished, deal with endless problems that developing countries have exposed with IMF and World Bank. So that was the big promise. None of it really happened.
Why is this the case, Richard?
Ideologically, the designers of policy never really broke with the neoliberal mindset that had dominated over the previous 30 years. A lot of people thought that this would be a sea change, given that clearly markets were the source of the problem. The government wasn't the source of the problem in 2009. Markets were the source of the problem. And so people thought, but there wasn't really a big ideological shift. And of course, after 30 years of this kind of development, there were a lot of vested interests who had done very well from these kinds of arrangements, who were going to resist change. In 2009, before the crisis hit, we were in a world which was awash with debts, huge amounts of debts, both public and private. We still had these hyper unequal world within countries, across countries. Inequality had certainly not been reduced significantly on some criteria, had increased further. Investment was weak, productive investment was weak, and growth was tepid. So that was the world in 2009 before COVID-19 hit us.
Has that changed very much fast forward 10 years?
It's got worse as a consequence of, for sure, the shock and the lockdown in an attempt to save lives and salvage healthcare systems that were under a huge amount of pressure as a consequence of COVID-19. That's made these problems even worse. We are now in the deepest recession that we've seen since the 1930s, and that is a world that is likely to increase inequalities, fragilities, etc. So the immediate short-term impact of COVID-19 is to make the inherited situation even worse.
In this context, is there a way to recover better?
If we're going to recover better, and everyone is now talking about the need to recover better, we have to learn from the mistakes that were made in 2009. This failure to generate a stable and robust recovery, we have to tackle that. One of the particular areas that is important to us and to developing countries is the problem of inherited indebtedness. Debt levels, not only in developing countries, but particularly in developing countries, rose significantly after the 2009 financial crisis for all kinds of reasons. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, credit is an important part of a dynamic system if it's used properly, right? But it does always expose the debtor to potential vulnerabilities. If you get external shocks of one kind or another, you can be very quickly exposed if you have a very high level of debt, if your growth slows down, if capital leaves your country rapidly, if your exchange rate gets, all these things can put you in a very vulnerable situation. And that's exactly what happened with COVID-19. The first reaction of financial markets was to take flight from developing countries. Capital moved out of developing countries in March of this year on a scale that was far greater than after the 2009 financial crisis. At the same time, you got exports were collapsing. Obviously, people weren't buying stuff. Exchange rates, with all these kinds of pressures, were then put on developing countries that that really squeezes the kind of economic lifeblood out of these economies.
You say that we have a policy choice in front of us that will determine whether or not we recover or we slip deeper into this crisis. What are the policy choices we need to make?
I mean, the first policy choice is for governments to keep spending. I mean, what's happened, I mean, and particularly the advanced economy governments that have the resources to do that. So, we can't make the mistake of going into austerity in response to the imbalances caused by a shock of this nature, as we did in 2009, because the private sector can't pull you out of this kind of crisis. Investors are nervous. They don't know what's coming down the road in 12 or 18 months, so they don't invest in long-term productive equipment where the returns from which are uncertain. Consumers are nervous. They have debts. They have commitments down the road, and they're worried, of course, themselves. So there's not going to be a surge of private sector demand given the uncertainties that have been unleashed by COVID-19. So that requires the government as the only source of reliable demand to keep spending. So the first thing is, don't go into austerity and engage in an expansionary macroeconomic policy for as long as it takes the private sector to regain confidence and start spending again. There's got to be a lot more fiscal spending by government rather than just throwing money at the problem, which is what happened in 2009. Central bank balance sheets mushroomed after 2009, but there was not a lot of government spending. Government has to spend on stuff this time in the advanced economies to keep their economies going and sustain a recovery. So that's the first thing. But it's not just about spending. We need to boost wages. I mean, wages have to be boosted. A major source of demand in the economy, major source of addressing the inequality problem. So we need to see in the advanced economies an increase in wages. It's a major source of demand and a major source of potential export earnings for developing countries. But we need industrial policy. We can't forget other problems that have been taking place, right? I mean, the climate problem has not gone away. We need to see shifts in our energy mix. We need to see shifts in the way in which transport systems are organized. We need to see shifts in the way in which we produce our food, the market won't do this. So we need industrial policy, innovation policy to complement the public investment that is needed in these sectors. So, I mean, there's a whole set of kind of interrelated policy measures that are needed to recover better and on a sustained basis. There are particular difficulties, of course, facing developing countries. They don't have the same fiscal space that advanced economies have, for starters, and they have very highly informal labor forces, which are much more difficult to deal with from an economic policy point of view. So developing countries, and they have very large debts. So one of the things that the report insists upon is that we need strong support from the multilateral economic system if developing countries are to participate in a strong and sustained recovery.
Exactly. Can you tell us what comes next? The report projects a short-term rebound. What happens after that?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk at the moment of a V-shaped recovery, this idea of a kind of bounce back to where we were before COVID-19 hit. It's a little bit, and we predict that, for example, we expect growth to contract for the global economy in the order of around 4.3% this year. We expect to see growth next year. Everything going right, if there's no lockdown, all predictions go up in smoke, right? But assuming that doesn't happen, assuming that the advanced economies maintain their current policy positions, we would expect to see growth, probably around above 4%. I think we have 4.1% in this year's report. But it's not a rebound. I mean, it still leaves a huge shortfall in the economy because we were expecting to grow this year in the order of 3.5, 3.6%. So even if we continue to grow, if we do hit 4.1% next year, it still leaves a $6 trillion shortfall in the global economy from where we expected to be 12 months ago. So yes, there's a recovery, but it's even under the circumstances that we hope prevail, it doesn't get us back to where we were. The worry is, and it's a serious worry, is that austerity, in response to the accumulated debts that governments have had to take on board to respond to the lockdown, many governments will resort once again to austerity as the way to rebalance their budgets, and that will be a disaster. It will be a disaster for the advanced economies themselves, and it will be a particular disaster for developing countries, because that means opportunities to export will disappear, foreign direct investment will not pick up in the same kind of way, et cetera, et cetera. So the worry is that we will repeat, despite all the talk that we've learned the lesson from 2009, we already see signs that policymakers are warning about excessive debt accumulation, that inflationary pressures are just around all the kind of things that we heard back in 2009. We're beginning to hear again today, and that will not only, in our estimation, and we try and model this in the report, will not only lead to a double-dip recession sometime in late 2021, early 2022, but will almost certainly lead to a lost decade for the rest of the 20s. That means the 2030 agenda, is dead before it's really got going. For sure, you cannot deliver the 2030 agenda in a period of sluggish growth and government cuts.
It feels like dark days if we don't make some good decisions. Is there an upside to this, Richard?
Well, I think the upside is that we're talking about this, right? I mean, one of the things that governments, particularly in advanced economies, have been forced to do is to, at least for the time being, reject some of the conventional policy wisdom that they have been wedded to for the last 20 or 30 years, right? So tax and spend, or at least the spend part, was not part of their acceptable policy framework before. Now they have to spend. They know just to stop things from getting really worse. Industrial policy is, people are talking about, why can't we produce masks? Why can't we produce ventilators? What do we need to do to make supply chains more resilient? All this stuff requires industrial policy, and people are again talking about the need. So there's a kind of opening up of what were previously taboo subjects that we in UNCTAD have been pushing for years as a necessary part of a healthy policy toolkit. And of course, behind that is a recognition that the state and the role of the public sector is central to any sort of healthy, balanced economy. And so that again goes against the grain of a lot of conventional wisdom. The big question, I think, and it's an important question, is will this last? That's the upside that we're having these discussions now. The worry is that there are ideological pressures and political interests that don't want to move in that direction. That's going to be the big challenge, I think, whether the kind of momentum for doing things differently and taking your own rhetoric seriously is going to persist beyond the actual immediate health crisis that we're still actually going through.
Thank you, Richard, for a very enlightening discussion about the Trade and Development Report of 2020. If you're interested in downloading it, it's available at UNCTAD.org.
Amy, thanks for the opportunity.